We have great pleasure this evening to host Dr. Carol Acton of the University of Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, as she describes the wartime career of Mary Morris, that's her married name, of the Queen Alexandra Nursing Corps. Having found and edited the astonishing diaries that Mary managed to write between 1939 and 1945 as a young woman in her early 20s. This is the fourth in a short series of talks in PRONI commemorating the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy. The first talk related the Normandy experiences of soldiers from Ulster, interviewed by Mark Scott in 2004. The second talk gave the story of the training of the 82nd Airborne Division in Northern Ireland during late 1943 and early 1944. And the third talk discussed the huge fleet that left Belfast Lough for the D-Day landings a few days before 6th of June 1944. These talks all looked at the lives of male soldiers and sailors. This talk homes in on the crucial experiences of non-combatant women, mostly, without whom the invasion would have barely progressed. It is only in the last couple of decades that women have begun to figure in our understanding of the conduct of the war. As an introduction to this talk, I'd like to mention the Biographical Dictionary of Irish Nurses during the Second World War. You can see it on the screen. This was compiled by Sean Graffin and Margaret Graham of the Royal College of Nursing, Northern Ireland, and published on the PRONI website in March this year. One of the discoveries of this project was the high proportion of nurses from the Irish Free State that served in the British Army during World War II. It was also while putting this together that we came across the name of Mary Mulry, later Morris, and that we read the captivating, unself-conscious, day-to-day memoir that she wrote up, edited by Dr. Carol Acton. It's impossible to read without being gripped by her vibrant personality and enthralled by her bravery and force of character, not to speak of her charm, wit, and beauty. Now, the landings took place on the 6th of June 1944, as we know. The field hospital where Mary served was southwest of Bayeux, about 6 miles inland from Gold Beach. Mary arrived on the 19th of June and worked there for about 2.5 months. What was it like when she got there? British troops had landed on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches north of Bayeux on the 6th of June during inclement weather. Though beachheads were established on all of the 5 Allied beaches, it was nearly a week before they were linked up. Male medical personnel accompanied the landing force and immediately set up beach dressing stations, for several days hurrying casualties, including Germans, back to hospital carriers who took them to the Isle of Wight. Bayeux, which was 5 miles inland, was taken at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of June, the day after the landing. The first female nurses arrived on the battlefield on the 13th of June, setting up bell tents for field dressing stations and hospitals where surgery was carried out before casualties were taken back to England. On the 14th of June, Charles de Gaulle disembarked and held a public meeting in Bayeux where he was greeted rapturously. The town was made the interim capital of France for over 2 months until Paris was liberated on the 25th of August. Until Cannes was taken on the 21st of July, after brutal fighting, the area was beset by the noise of conflict and violence. A nurse in a field hospital about the 14th of July, close to where Mary worked, mentioned that the nights were very noisy with gunfire and shrapnel, the ground heaved from heavy explosions, the ground shakes and the air batters. A number of nurses broke down from nervous tension. It seems that Mary... Now this is the Normandy landings. I read this out and I forgot. Here's the map of the Normandy landings, an army map. And you can see Bayeux just south of Gold Beach. Royal Marines landing on Gold Beach on the 6th of June. Canadian Army messengers and others landing on the 6th of June. British Army marching inland near Bayeux on a couple of days later. And then this is a map which is in the Public Record Office in Kew, which is just a simple hand-drawn map, and it gives the distribution of hospital units in the summer of 1944. This conglomeration of hospital units was known as Harley Street. And you can see over on the right, closest to Bayeux, where the tents of 101 General British Hospital were laid out. That's where Mary Mulry was working. So now I'll pass you on to Dr. Acton. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Des, for that introduction. And I really feel that I should be standing back a bit here and putting Mary in front. And that's what I hope I'm going to be doing. Because as Des said, she is quite an extraordinary person, and that comes through in the diary. And I wanted to focus on, or I will focus on the Normandy landings and her role there. But also just to say, you know, how important I think it is for the women's experience to have a voice, because as I was mentioning previously, just to as in Grace, I didn't see anything on the BBC about the women's experience. So that's sort of where this comes from in a way. The other part of it is that it's very unusual to find Second World War diaries by nurses. I only know of one other one, which is an American one. And this diary was in the Imperial War Museum. There's a typescript of it in the Imperial War Museum. There was no context given for it. I didn't know she was Irish until I'd read several entries in and discovered that. And then when I was reading it, I was wondering, well, surely somebody's published this by now. How is it that nobody's published this? And so I waited for quite a while thinking, you know, isn't this going to happen? And then realized that actually, no, I better do it myself, because I don't think anyone else is going to do it. And so this is how it looked. I'll give a plug for it, because I think everybody will enjoy reading it, and I'm sure it's been in public libraries quite a lot. So I'm sure if you don't want to buy it, it's going to be in the public library. If you notice on the cover, you'll see that there are stock photos there. So if you got the Blitz on the bottom, and this is the British one. They also did an Irish version, which has little cottages on the bottom. And you've got the soldiers coming ashore there on the top. And those are kind of the stock images that we have, but we often don't get the private experience behind that. And so in the talk, I wanted to sort of juxtapose those public images with the private experience that we find in the diary. So I'll start out just with a little bit about Mary as a child and her background. So she grew up in Galway. Her mother died when she was like 3 weeks after she gave birth to Mary, and so she was brought up by an aunt. This photo is with her favorite cousin Tommy, and I love the photo because which doesn't come into the diary because they used a different one. But this is my favorite because I think you see a character here that you get carrying on through the diary. There's just sort of a sense of somebody who has a strong personality, the way she has her hand on her hip. But Tommy also features in the diary, and so I just like to put up that picture because I think it says something about the character that we're going to meet. So basically, in the talk, I'll talk about the Normandy, or focus primarily on the Normandy experience. After Normandy, she was also caring for patients that were coming out of the Battle of Arnhem. And if we have time, I can include a little bit of that. And also there'll be time for questions at the end, so I can fill in other gaps if any of you have questions. So I wanted to bring in some ideas about her approach here and how she felt about writing the diary. So once you were sent overseas, keeping a diary was forbidden. So it already tells you something about Mary, that she's willing to go against the grain. And you will see in the diary, or you if you read the diary, you will see that she's often willing to be somewhat subversive. But she's saying, you know, I resent having my private letters censored. So I'm going to keep track of things that happen. And every so often she will point to a particular situation where she really wants to record it because she thinks that this won't be recorded, or this won't be spoken afterwards. But on the other side of this, she seems frustrated that she's not able to write what she wants to write. And yet, of course, when we read it, we're saying, no, you could write. Yes, you did. You were able to do this. So I think that the ideas are getting across. So she started out nursing in London. She went to train in 1939. The hospital that she was in, she sat the exams for Guy's Hospital, which was the top nursing training hospital in London. As the war was starting, they were sent down to the Kent and Sussex Hospital, parts of Guy's Hospital in London. And she trained there and subsequently went to specialize in fever nursing in London after that. And then in the spring of 1944, she doesn't give a reason why she joined the QAs, but she was very determined to get in. And the matron of her civilian hospital did not want her to leave, but she was stubborn, and she did. And this is her in her dress uniform, and she's obviously, taking a great deal of delight in that. She sees something that's important, I think, about the wearing of the uniform. There are a couple of reasons for this, I think. One of them may be a subversive one, because her father had fought in the 1916 Rising, and had been in the War of Independence in Ireland. And so, her putting on the British Army uniform might have been a bit of a challenge to him. But I think she also saw herself as part of this group of women who were doing something that women, had not really done before, or at least to their knowledge. So this is her entry when she's on the way through the south of England, before she embarked on the 19th. They were supposed to leave later, but the weather was very bad, so her hospital ship was held up. And of course, but by the time they got to landing, the sea was already rough again, and that's where we get a great experience, which we'll look at in a minute, of the landing. But I think the idea of the uniform and of the person behind the uniform is important. There's a Canadian nurse who talked about her wearing the uniform. She says, "I think we suddenly felt that we were respected. We were known by our uniform. We felt good in our uniform. People knew who we were by our uniform." And we can see this in Mary's rather amusing piece here. So she first of all, this is where she writes about this being a very private diary. The title, this is where the title for the published diary came from, and it's actually the editor who liked that and picked on that. But she's, there, you can just imagine them all in the back of this truck. Troops and armored vehicles everywhere, and I was amused to see how quickly the wolf whistle was transformed into a smart salute when the soldiers noticed our two pips. And you can see that that's clearly a sense of, we're not just any women, we are nurses and we are officers. And the fact that she adds on the 16th of June her number, I think is important. And also that she says we are ready to move off at 0700 hours tomorrow. She doesn't normally use time that way, but of course this is military time. So she's bringing us into that context. This is an image from the 101 British General Hospital, from a website. So it's not something that's with the diary, but just thought it was interesting to get a sense of, the group going over. And this is Mary's account of leaving Southampton and then arriving. And you can see the excitement here. The sailors kept bringing us cups of tea from the galley and appeared astonished by our temerity in entering this man's world. Tried to look cool and nonchalant, but lapped up the obvious admiration. And you can see that she's really enjoying this. So even though the situation is tense, she's still aware that, she's a woman there being seen by the men and doing something unusual and extraordinary. But she's also aware of the fact that there's something, of what's going on around them. Flares dropping everywhere, the whine of tracer bullets. A passing sailor said, "Jerry is busy tonight." The elements too were busy, the churning sea slamming against the sides of the ship and soaking us with spray. And then you've got the waves, the gunfire, fireworks. Strangely thrilling, she says, the type of excitement associated with the fear of the unknown. So she doesn't seem to be particularly afraid here. She seems to be, as she comes back to write this in retrospect, just a day later, she's kind of hanging on to that excitement, I think. And then she gives us a more immediate sense of what is happening. They hear an explosion. And of course, later they'll find that that was their sister ship. And it gives us an idea of how dangerous this situation was. So although the beachhead was supposedly secure, it wasn't really secure. It was still dangerous. And she's talking about how they are going to get down off the ship and onto the landing craft to land. Now, I don't know how many of you have been on a ship. Even if you've been on a reasonably small ferry or something, if you think about what it's like to look down over the side of a ship and that you have to scramble down that on a net in seas that are tossing the boat back and forth and tossing the landing craft back and forth, and knowing what you are going to have to do, I could imagine that it would be extraordinarily terrifying, actually. But she still got a sense of humor. The sailors had attached the scrambling net to the side of the ship, and in theory, we were to descend in agile fashion down this net. The men on the landing craft were ready to catch us as we jumped aboard. This was the theory, but the heavy seas made the synchronization of these events highly unlikely. So she's aware of this as she's going down. And then in the next entry, which is just after that, she's talking about how she's lowered over the side of the deck, being held on, and then she's got to scramble down the net. I thought I was almost there when a voice behind me said, "Hold on until the exact moment I say, and then jump backwards." They assured me they would catch me at the right moment, but it must be right. I was soaked in spray by now, cold, wet, and frightened. But when someone shouted, "Now," I fell straight back into waiting arms. The relief was instantaneous. So she does capture this, right? She's relating it as it's happening. And so it pulls you right into the experience. And then she has to add, the joke at the end. The sailors on the landing craft were a very jolly bunch, full of jokes and laughter. We were the first English women who had literally fallen into their arms in Normandy. So you sort of get a feeling of, we're all in this together. And then finally they're ashore. But in contrast to that, which is, about excitement and the thrill of the danger and so on, she then has this much more somber account of the actual the scene when she's, once they're off the ship and they're moving towards Bea. The parting of clouds of dust revealed huge tanks on the side of the road, black from burning. Dozens of them with the dead crews hanging half in and half out of the turrets and escape hatches. Mile after mile of destroyed armored cars, and always the dust, heat, and stench of decaying maggot-ridden bodies. So she's not shying away from this. She's not turning her back on it. She's recording it. And when she records it, of course, she's recording it for herself. But I think, as with many diary writers, she also has a sense that perhaps someone is going to read this later, that she's capturing this, and there's a reason for it. And so when we read this, we can see it, right? We are there with her. She then arrives at the hospital, which Des showed you so well, the plan of the hospitals. And these are some stock photos. So waiting for food, which I think is interesting because you've got a difference between some of the women are wearing trousers and some of them are wearing skirts, and it all looks fairly informal, unlike the more formal photos that you're used to, we often see with military units. This is a tent hospital, which I know Des put up, and again, a stock photo. And I think it's interesting because, later on she describes the mud and how, they're wearing Wellington boots, and this looks very clean and tidy. So a little bit, you have to add a little bit, I think, to this to get a better sense of what it was actually like. Now she starts her actual nursing, and you can see that this is a few days later. It's the 24th of June. They're getting set up in the hospital because the ship that came over with them had been blown up. They have to find equipment all over. They're sort of indenting for equipment. They don't have good equipment. She's having to sterilize things with methylated spirits, which she's not used to doing. If anyone has read First World War nursing accounts, you'll know that that's what they did in that war. But she says that it's like being back with Florence Nightingale. But this is again a fairly clean and tidy tent. but it's what she says about it, I think, that brings us into the experience. She's in charge of 35 men. These are 35 seriously wounded men. It is daunting to see so many intravenous strips, trolleys with bloody dressings everywhere. And then she talks about the German prisoners of war. And these are kids, right? These are kids that were arrested a bit earlier after they had landed, who were just sort of hanging around, deserters, I think, probably. And they were only 15 years old. So they are helping out before they're going to be sent back to England. And they're taking around tea. And she looks at this, and she's not just thinking about the men and the wounded and what she's doing as a nurse. She's also reflecting on the situation itself. And she says, my mind wanders for a while as I think of this ward and my charges. This multinational microcosm of a Europe at war is interesting and sad. A badly wounded Cockney says, thanks, mate, to Hans as he gives him his tea and fixes his pillows. Why are they all tolerant of each other inside this canvas tent and killing each other outside? And so she has a sense of that, the absurdity of that. And in another later entry, she talks about her ward as an international ward, and she really sees that as as offering a possibility. So she's thoughtful along with her professional experience that she's bringing here. Now, I have a couple of entries from the memoir of another nurse who was working in the area at the same time. And I think what you see here is you see a memoir, which is kind of the long view and the more general view. And then Mary's immediate writing in the diary. But this gives you a sense of kind of the overall picture. I remember the continuous challenge of falling blood pressures and the terrible hemorrhages when blood tripped to the tarpaulin floor at a faster rate than we could pour it into a vein. So Brenda McBride, in a great, if any of you are interested, this is a great memoir called A Nurse's War. And she gives you, I suppose, more of the specific information here that Morris doesn't dwell on, but it was obviously something that she was doing as well. McBride also realizes that all of her training is now suddenly being needed, and she actually recognizes that she has the confidence to do it. She talks about giving injections of morphia and the new wonder drug penicillin. And of course, penicillin was hugely important for the invasion. The British had developed penicillin, but they couldn't find anyone in the lead up to the D-Day invasion. They couldn't find a company in Britain who was willing to produce it in large amounts. So that went to the United States because they knew that along with all of the military equipment, the arms and so on, that they also needed to treat people who were going to be wounded. And penicillin was what made the difference between people surviving and people dying. If you read accounts from the First World War, you'll see that one of the difficulties for nurses was that they would watch men dying of infection over a period of time. Penicillin changed all that. And of course, penicillin, as some of you might know, was developed by a company that is probably a household name now after COVID. So some of you can probably guess who that is. That was Pfizer. So Pfizer was in there with the penicillin, helping people to survive. Now we're sort of moving back into a much more specific focus here. So Brenda McBride kind of gives us an overview because she's looking back years later. The diary entries, I think what's great about the diary entries in providing you with a sense of the immediate experience is that they focus in on specific events. And so Mary is asked to assist Colonel Cordwell at breakfast. He asks her to assist when he's in surgery. And she talks about how she dreads that because she's afraid of him because he's quite abrupt. But she captures this experience. The heat in the tent was heavy and oppressive, and the flies were very worrying, the possible carriers of infection. I stood there for nearly 6 hours, silently handing Colonel Cordwell the instruments at the right moment. He never spoke, and I had to watch carefully to mop his brow periodically. I mean, she's really capturing that feeling. The tent is heavy and oppressive, because of the heat, but also because for her, I think there is this feeling of tension. And 6 hours just handing across instruments. We were all exhausted by 4 p.m. and went to sit on the grass outside to drink a cup of tea. The two worst cases were still to come, and we feared that both of these young men would lose a leg. Morris, throughout her diary, is always very concerned about her patients, and she focuses on them quite specifically. Earlier in the diary, she writes in people's names and she describes their experiences, and we'll see an example of that a bit later. But she talks about her position as a nurse here, which is both personal and professional. They both lost a leg, and my own personal sadness for them was intermingled with exhaustion and the nauseating job of clearing up the bloodstained theater afterwards and carrying away the legs to an incinerator and watching until they are completely burned. I mean, that really brings us into what this is all about. It's not, it's easy to sort of have an idea of and an ideal of the nurses who are all doing this wonderful work. But here she spells it out for us, right? This is, carrying the leg to the incinerator and watching until they're burned. And then she gives us a sense of what it's like. And then she has to go back to the ward, went back to the ward to check on the post-operative medication and treatment and write a report for the night staff. And then at the end of that entry, she just says, too tired to eat any supper. And so you get a sense of the exhaustion of what this was like doing this day after day after day. But she just fills us in with just this, this one specific example. On the 5th of July, she brings us into an extreme situation. She's called in the middle of the night to go to the hospital tent. And she provides us just with this opening scene. Stretchers all down the middle of the tent, charred bodies everywhere. Some were quiet and dying, others screaming with pain. And then she describes what her situation is. Their bodies were black, their appearance horrific. We gave them more morphine, watched helplessly as they died. We moved the dead out of the ward and got on with trying to save the living. They were all so young and terribly frightened. And then there's a pause, and she brings us into what has actually happened here. And it's as though she's writing to sort of capture the experience as she had it herself, coming in, not knowing what's happened, not knowing why all of these men are here and they're dying. And then she describes this event, which is told to her by one of the young officers. And I see I've got a typo. I thought I'd looked at these very carefully, but I obviously didn't. There was bitter fighting somewhere near Carpiquet Aerodrome. The Canadians wear a darker shade of khaki uniforms to ours, similar to the Germans. Our troops attacked them with flamethrowers, thinking they were an enemy target. Such is the stupidity and futility of war. We did everything possible for these young men, but 19 in all are dead. Spent the afternoon in the depressing task of trying to identify the dead, filling their label details and laying them out. Their average age was 20 years. They had so much living to do, feel tired and depressed. And of course, she's only about 23 here herself. So, seeing these people who are very close in age to her and feeling helpless. And then on the 9th of July, she records, felt too ill and tired to write this for a few days. And this is something else you see in diaries, which is that it's easy to kind of jump over from one entry to the next and not notice when there are gaps. But she draws attention to this, the fact that she really couldn't write anymore, that she really doesn't, she can't. She if you imagine sitting down and rewriting that, you're reliving it. But she can bring in at least, one positive aspect where she says Jock McCabe is a little better in reacting to penicillin. The other boys at Burns are not so good. The smell is terrible. So again, it's not just about the wounded. It's about these men who were burned in a friendly fire incident. And she wants us to know that these things happen in war, such as the stupidity and futility of war, she says. So this is a I'm cognizant of the time here, so I'm watching. This is a photograph of the hospital just before they left. So this was at the end of their time in Normandy. And I don't know if any of you can see Mary in that photo. I can't zone in on it, I don't think, but she is right here. I don't know if you can see my pen, right in the middle. And she looks as though she's chatting to somebody beside her, which I found amusing because she was always getting into trouble for being too chatty, too talkative to the patients. And so I'm imagining that she has this sort of bubbly, effervescent kind of character. And I'm sure she was telling somebody a joke while they were getting their photograph taken there. But you can sort of see her moving back and forth between, focusing on the really terrible events, but also having this kind of energy that keeps her going, and a resilience, which I think is remarkable because she doesn't seem, at least according to her family, she doesn't seem to have suffered from any kind of trauma after the war. She seems capable of dealing with it, and perhaps the fact that she was writing it out in her diary was one of the reasons why she managed to maintain that kind of sense of self, and didn't let it overcome her resilience. And I said that there were some other specific events here that I wanted to just move on to very briefly. So I'll do that, just take another couple of minutes, because after Normandy, they are following the troops, and they are now at this point treating patients from the Battle of Arnhem. And I wanted to give you this example because it's a good example of where she takes one person, one of her patients, and she writes in a lot of detail. Now, I haven't put all of that detail in here because it would just be too long. But she obviously is just allowing them to talk to her and get it out, right? She's almost sort of therapy for them, listening to them. And she's writing about the Battle of Arnhem from this person's perspective. And he's talking about how terrible it is, but she's aware that he's in a state of nervous shock, that he's, responding to her, listening to him. He's describing the experience. Men were running around screaming, trying to find any escape. But she's commenting, Brian will be all right physically once his wound has healed, but I think it will be a long time before he gets over the shock of Arnhem. Connie, who is one of her fellow nurses, one of her friends, tells me he has to be constantly sedated at night to stop him screaming in terror. He is only 22 years old. And it's that, the way she just pauses there for you. Connie tells me he has to be constantly sedated at night to stop him screaming in terror. He's only 22 years old. Brings you into the experience. And she's sort of taking it on herself here as well, I think. So I'm just going to do a quick skip through a couple of other. This is a doctor who was at the Battle of Arnhem, who writes about the experience of being there. He had a hospital. He had a hospital that was set up on the side of the street in Arnhem, essentially. But he also creates this sense of the way the hospital works, because everybody is trying to survive and do the best they can, whether they're British or German. Outside erupting chaos, inside a brotherhood of suffering and service. Wounded nurses, orderlies, administrators, padres, doctors, all face to face with the same crashing world, all digging down into their deepest sources of endurance and miraculously finding something that answered their purpose. And I think that's where what we find. Mary doesn't articulate that directly, but I think that's something that we find in her writing as well. We also have, the doctor's perspective here. Who would say that the act of killing is glorious, of bereaving, of maiming, of destroying other people's property? And then he sort of comes back to the same observations that she makes. Why are they all, they're all together here? Why are they all killing each other outside? Anyone interested in starting a war should come and spend an hour or two among the suffering wounded. Observe German and British lying helpless side by side, indistinguishable in their bravery. So you have that sort of reflected in her writing as well. But then, and I'm just going to finish up here, I've got another couple of slides to show you. This is this is the other side of her life. Des mentioned, the romantic side of her life. She's always got some man chasing her. Sometimes she likes that, sometimes she doesn't. But there are so many of these dances. And here's, had a wonderful time. Bill was there, also Tim and Richard Kelvin. Tim was in a very flirtatious mood, much to the annoyance of the other two. I was in great demand, which was extremely pleasant. We all danced and talked and drank champagne until 4 a.m. Social life is very exciting at the moment. So you do have this other side to the work. And I think it was probably very important to have that, right? To have that escape, because otherwise you wouldn't survive. Here's a little kind of hint for those of you who haven't read the diary and might be thinking of reading it. This is a sort of, what would I say, an extension of the romance narrative throughout the story, amongst the many. Here is a moment where she meets this blonde young man who stood up and asked Charlie if I would like to have a dance. He's hopeless at dancing, completely hopeless, fell over by feet. I thought the best thing would be to sit down and give him some coffee. He told me his name was Malcolm. So when you're reading the diary, he's the one to look out for, essentially. And then just to finish off, and as I said, I can certainly answer questions, so I can fill in some more if you like. Here's an entry, which is her response to the war, and her response not just to the physical wounding of soldiers, but also to their mental wounding. And I think this is important because it shows how empathetic she is. It shows how she sees this in the larger context of the war, and how she's willing to challenge, the larger narrative. But at the time that she's writing, there wasn't an awful lot of sympathy for people who were suffering from what in the First World War they called shell shock, Second World War battle fatigue. So the idea of mental breakdown was often, and she reports on some of the doctors just not being sympathetic to these men at all. She says the mental suffering of these boys is painful to endure. The aftermath of war can be excruciating for people whose minds have been wounded. It upsets me to see so much ongoing suffering. And I feel strongly that it's all of us who are young now who must shape the world of the future for ourselves. And this is an entry in the diary which really feels as though it's reaching out beyond just her immediate experience and to a later reader. I am tired of the Churchills and the Pattons of this war who enjoy the power it gives them. It is a game to them. These boys are the victims, heroes today, forgotten tomorrow. And I just wanted to finish on that because I think it sort of sums up her sense of what is right, but also her ability to look beyond, and to question, and at the same time to be very empathetic in an environment where not everybody else was, right? She's challenging the status quo here. So I'm just going to finish now, and I'm happy to answer any questions to bring you further forward, bring you further back, and talk a bit more about the diary or any of the sort of the rest of the context there.